Well, welcome back, folks. Hopefully everyone had a good break. We'll get things going here shortly. You guys are in luck. The most fascinating and best speaking spot of the day is about to begin, the very last one. And after listening to me drone on all day, you get to listen to me for another hour. Believe me, my wife feels bad for you. So I'll try to make this as quick and painless as I can. We're going to be talking today about Indigenous capacity building, some of the approaches and experiences that I've kind of experienced over my varied career. For those of you that don't know me, I know most of the people I think on this call here today, or at least quite a few of them. My family has been in the industry, in the forestry business for about 4 generations or so. Me, my dad, grandpa, great grandpa, in what's now Alberta. So I'm fairly active, as you can imagine. I started out in the government side, family biz, working for Alberta Forest Service back in the early 90s on initial TAC, and then moved into planning and whatnot in the private sector. I worked through with what used to be Ziedler's and is now West Fraser and Slivik Pulp and a few others, and then went into the utility side, working for ACO Electric and AltaLink, helping them some of their forestry aspect and planning related aspects of the job until about 2013 when I started Maskwa Environmental Consulting, and it's been in business ever since. I'm one of the partners there, and we do quite a bit of work, forestry included, but we work across all industries and deal with a lot of the permitting and planning aspects. No matter what you're looking to do, we kind of help you get the approvals in place to do that type of thing. So as you can imagine, Indigenous engagement and consultation, capacity building, and all those areas kind of go hand in hand with a lot of the work that I do. And I bumped into quite a bit of it, not only in the forestry side, but oil and gas, utilities, and government, and with the communities themselves. We kind of do work all over. So I was going to share with you today some of my learnings. Happy to answer questions at the end. So I will share my screen here and get my presentation going. There we go. So again, we're going to talk about Indigenous capacity building. The plan for today is to kind of hit on 4 main areas. So one, who are the Indigenous people? Second, what is Indigenous consultation? Those first 2, I'm going to burn through pretty quick. That's pretty well covered ground, I think, today from some of the presentations we've already had. But feel free to ask me questions about them. I'm just going to burn through them fairly quickly, and then focus a bit on obviously what is capacity building, and then I'll go through some of the examples and projects and things like that where I've actually seen it put into play. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So I want to start out, as some of the other speakers have done as well, just with the territorial acknowledgement. So again, it's a virtual conference. It's not like we're all sitting in one room together, but again, it's still worthwhile. Like I say, so today, it's like the honor to acknowledge that today's virtual technical sessions being delivered to and attended by participants throughout the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples for Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and likely more. We do have some remote folks. And then we'll also like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Métis Nation of Alberta, my nation. Embracing the spirit of reconciliation, respect, and truth, we also acknowledge all those who call and make the traditional territories within Alberta their home. We welcome everyone here today. So who are the Indigenous people? I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, like I said, guys. Basically, the Section 35 of the Constitution Act from 1982 stipulates this. And again, well-covered ground. There's 3 groups, the Indian, Inuit, and Métis. We don't have a lot of Inuit in Alberta or in our area, so it's generally the First Nations and the Métis that we deal with. Again, I won't spend a ton of time here. Métis versus First Nations. I'm assuming most of the folks on the call are fairly familiar, but just in case, Métis in Alberta at any rate is generally provincial. It's provincial lands. They live on settlements, municipal type governments. We've got 8 settlements on about 1.25 million acres, 6 main government zones, and they have the Métis Settlement General Council kind of acts on their behalf. First Nations, again, federal lands, reserves, chief and council or band custom. 46 nations in 3 different treaty areas with 140 reserves over 2 million acres. And again, tribal councils, technical service groups, and things like that go in play. 3 main treaties. Again, we've already heard all about those. I will note, and I think it was mentioned before, there are actually 5 treaties in Alberta. We get a little bit of 4 and a little bit of 10 that kind of poke their way in on this map, as you can see them. But again, for the most part, there's no reserves or settlements on those lands. It would be just traditional territory issues that we'd be dealing with in those areas for the most part. Again, won't regurgitate a lot of this, but here's a map, gives you a rough idea where all these reserves are located across the province. And then we're getting into the Métis side. This shows where those 6 Métis zones are and the different settlements. I want to touch a bit on consultation, because understanding where the Indigenous communities are, which we just did, and then also goes hand in hand with how we talk to them, how we engage them, how we consult with them in relation to capacity building. Again, fairly well covered ground today. I'll touch a bit on this. This was the definition that was put forward by Kurt and Rob this morning from the ACO. This is their definition, and it's one should be fairly familiar to everybody who's done any type of Indigenous engagement or consultation in Alberta at this point. What I will share is some key considerations, mainly from my perspective. Like I say, that should always be in mind when you're engaging. So, I mean, those 5 things on the ACO side and a lot of the other things we heard today, these are kind of the things that I've kind of learned as I've started to go through this. And a lot of this should be fairly familiar and shouldn't be shocking to anybody. You know, there's first thing you always got to remember, there's always at least 2 sides in any engagement, right? And neither side is necessarily right or wrong, right? People can look at that picture to the right. You know, some people will see a duck, some people will see a rabbit. Are either of them right or wrong? No, they're both right. They both see what they see. It's just a matter of perspective. So you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes and to understand what they're saying. So again, recognize that not everyone sees or thinks in the same way. This is particularly important when you're dealing with vastly different entities like we're talking about here today. When I talk about entities, I'm talking about, you know, the Indigenous communities themselves. We've got private sector organizations that have different mandates and perspectives and drivers. We've got government regulatory agencies who have mandates to enforce and jurisdictions to oversee. And then we've got people that play amongst the 3 of them. So all the people that are involved in that, for sure, have different perspectives as it applies to not only the Indigenous and consultation engagement aspect, but to whatever it is that they're trying to get done, right? Empathy, extremely important when you're dealing with Indigenous engagement. You always try to understand the contention before responding to it. So if someone's really upset or mad or getting pissed off, you shouldn't respond immediately with some kind of retort. You should say, okay, pause for a second here. Why are you getting mad? Or even think to yourself, why are they getting mad? Why are they getting upset? And try to understand the perspective that they're coming from. You'll find it's a lot easier to get to a solution or some kind of mitigated strategy if you both are being open and try to understand each other versus just kind of barking your positions at one another. You know, and there's differences. You know, differences are normal and ultimately is the reason why we're talking. If everyone was getting along, holding hands and singing Kumbaya, we wouldn't need processes and policies. And the reality is that's just not going to happen. We've got a very complex narrative and dynamic here that we're all kind of stuck with, and we need to try to find a way to work forward together collaboratively on that front. And again, this is mentioned a few times today and bears repeating. You know, consultation doesn't necessarily mean agreement or consensus all the time. It means having an open and honest and meaningful discussion and exchange. You may disagree at the end of it. I've had many situations where that's the case, and you still proceed, but at least you've done so and you made the attempt and you understand fully from both sides and perspectives what's involved and why people maybe don't still agree with things. Next one, choice. This is another one I think it's touched on a bit here today, but I want to. This comes front and center in just about every engagement I have, and it isn't just with Indigenous communities. I deal with landowners and landowner groups, and a lot of other kind of contentious situations. But you remember that the person who's coming with who's driving the conversation, who's initiating it, who's the very reason why the conversation is even happening, it needs to kind of acknowledge the fact that they're going to someone who never asked to even hear from them, didn't want the phone to ring, has no interest in whatever the project is you're going. You could go away and their day would be the same, right? So you need to recognize that even though it's really important to you and you got a lot of stuff that you need to get done in a certain way and you're trying to follow all the processes, not all the individuals and other folks that you're trying to engage with are as passionate or care as much as you do. Or they may be, but they may be for different reasons, right? So you just need to understand you're not all seeing same things the same way, and you're not all coming from the same place. So it's important to know that if you've got something, then that really the onus is on you to kind of drive and to work with people and to kind of keep things moving forward as much as you can and to try to overcome some of the challenges you run into, because really at the end of the day, you want that involvement. It's not the other way around. They want it if you're going to impact them, but you want to be part of a collaborative discussion in that sense. And this is where it comes into, participation versus process. Like this was touched on before by Chris, and I know Kate and Todd touched on it, and so did Rob and Kurt there this morning as well. Meaningful engagement is more than just showing up with a legislative checklist. This is what it says I have to do. Bang, bang, bang. Now I move on. Meaningful consultation is sure that's part of it. Like we all have the rules and the laws that we have to work within, but the more meaningful side or the more effective side of that consultation typically goes beyond that. Like we heard from Todd and I few of the others. It means saying, yeah, we can talk about that and use it as the basis for the discussion, but let's try to understand what's driving each of us, what each of us wants, what each of us is worried about, and try to find some common ground. And in all likelihood, that usually involves some degree of compromise, but it doesn't necessarily mean throwing a baby out with the bathwater. Like, there's usually an answer, a solution. And pain and gain should be shared. This is where it comes down to compromise. An open mind, a willingness to consider reasonable compromise that strives to mitigate potential impacts to all can be valuable. So not just yourself, but everybody, right? So the Indigenous consultation. So this, I'm going to go through a few of these just to mention things. So we had heard about the Aboriginal, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. So the certification program that was talked briefly about by Chris, and I'd asked him a question about this. What we have is that this is a certification program, voluntary at this point. But I want to mention is because in all the dealings that I've been doing with, this is coming up more and more often, and it seems to be where we're migrating, and I'm not surprised by it, because we've seen this in a lot of other areas that we deal with professionally. So whether it be moving towards a certification process, like initially used to be forced care, and then it moved into ISO, and now we're into FSC and some of the others. Those provide, basically a minimum set of qualifications and buy-in to on a certain philosophy that isn't shared. And people know that if you've gone through that audit successfully, you've done certain things. You come with certain things kind of ready to go. And this is kind of heading in the same direction. If you've moved towards this, you're committing to certain principles, whether it be through engagement or capacity building or otherwise, you'll find that it'll start to open a few more doors in some of the discussions you're having. By no means am I saying this is what everyone has to run out and do. I'm just saying this is out there. You heard it mentioned at least 2 or 3 times today. You're going to hear it mentioned more and more as we go forward in our careers, is my prediction. And I'll just briefly run through them. I mean, there's 5 main factors for ethical and effective Indigenous corporate collaboration. This is what they view. One is community-defined development goals. So again, this is more on the onus on the community itself. They need to have a pretty clear idea where it is, who they are, what it is, where it is they want to go, and what it is they're worried about, right? So that, and if they don't know that, it's going to be difficult to get into some impact, laden or mitigation type discussion. So it's important to have those type of discussions with the communities you're working on if you can. Transparent corporate motivation. We've heard transparency, being open. That's nothing new to anybody here. Mutual trust through joint accountability and continuous communication. So again, more than just checking off the checklist. It's actually talking on a regular basis, keeping each other informed as things change, checking in from time to time, and holding each other accountable. It's not just one or the other, everybody, right? Everyone has commitments and everyone's expected to live up to those commitments. 4, cross-cultural bridging mechanisms. So again, appropriate cross-cultural bridging mechanisms and appropriate integration of Indigenous cultural considerations into the design. So this has come up in a variety of ways here today. Understanding who the community is, and understanding what it is that they want. So this can mean a lot of things, Indigenous and cultural awareness training for staff that are involved in this, working with the communities themselves to better understand. We heard some great suggestions from Todd and some of the others, as far as coming to Sweat Lodge or going to some of these, I know other bands like Chiefs and Sunchild First Nation, for example, hold industry sessions on an annual basis to check in with all the companies that are working in their areas. These are ways to get to know one another, right? And something that I would certainly encourage. And then you also want a common goal. Everyone wants this with lasting mutual benefits. I hear this all the time. I don't want to talk to you. You tell me all these great things you're going to do, and then we agree, and then you're gone like smoke in the wind after your project's done. Indigenous communities expect more than just that one-off discussion. They expect if you're going to come work with them and you're going to take the time to get to know them, and they're going to take the time out of their day to get to know you and work with you, they expect it to last beyond, right? And for them to then be able to kind of approach you and vice versa as time goes on. So with that said, I'll get a bit into capacity building. So this is a fairly generic one from the United Nations, but pretty applicable. Capacity building is defined as a process of developing and strengthening the skills, instincts, abilities, processes, and resources that organizations and communities need to survive, adapt, and thrive in a fast-changing world. Fairly generic, but it does apply here as well, right? Because the reality is, like from my experience, is that, and we've heard this mentioned a few times today, the primary rub that we run into between the various folks that you heard talk today and the people that bump into each other as we're dealing with Indigenous rights or Indigenous engagement or capacity building for that matter is that you've got these different aspects of the whole dynamic that are still kind of evolving. We've got the Indigenous communities themselves, like we heard from Todd there, where we've got multiple communities that are pretty clear in their mind what they want, and they've even gone so far as to develop their own consultation processes and expectations that they want industry and government to kind of meet. Then we've got the government, who has, you know, the delegated authority, or the authority to actually duty to consult, that have to then react to that within their mechanisms. So whether it's, you know, putting together the Aboriginal Consultation Office like they did in Alberta to kind of deal with a lot of that, it differs from province to province, but they've got that, right? And they have a job to do, and they're trying to do the best they can with what they do, right? And then we've got industry, and whether it be oil and gas, forestry, or otherwise, who are stuck in there, and they're trying to make everybody happy, both the Indigenous communities and the regulatory authority who they need the approvals from. And it's tough, especially when everything keeps changing, right? And you got different ways of doing those things. So it's hard, right, to put it bluntly. And as a result of that, we have a lot of these struggles. Like we got some flavors of that today showing up in some of the exchanges and questions and what have you. You just got people that either don't understand, even though they want to understand, or they think they understand, but things are changing and they're still trying to catch up, right? So the reality is we're all kind of reacting to one degree or another. So capacity building, which we'll get into here, is one of the ways in which we can kind of try to manage that or overcome some of those issues. Because in particular, as it applies to Indigenous communities, the reality is that as much as they may want to work with you, they're just not as equipped or sophisticated as some of the proponents, whether it be companies or otherwise, that are coming in, right? And then the companies expect them to respond in the same way and be just as passionate and involved. And the reality is they may not have the resources, they may not have the qualified people in place, they may not have the departments and processes and other things that they can respond to in a timely or wanted or preferred way, right? So you need to work with them to kind of establish that, right? You know, and it's easy to say, well, you know, if you don't have the capacity, then I guess we'll just do the best we can to move on. And I've seen that too, but they usually don't work well, right? And that really isn't engaging. If you're trying to engage and you're trying to work in good faith with an Indigenous community, you need to talk to them, I guess is what we're saying, and get a fairly clear idea, because everyone is different. I've yet to come to a First Nation community or a Métis community that I'm working with, and they're like, oh, this is just like the last one or one I did before. They're all different. So why is it important? I'll get into some of these impacts. Obviously, if you're looking to build something or cut something or put a road in or a bridge in, if you're trying to do something and make something there today that wasn't there yesterday, there's going to be an impact of some type, right? And that's usually one of the key drivers here. So if we're talking about a harvest plan, for example, you're going to remove a bunch of timber. You're going to open up some of the landscape. You're going to be building roads in there to haul equipment in and out and wood in and out. You're going to be putting in river crossings and creek crossings. There's all kinds of things that are going to be done and developed out there in the landscape as part of that activity that is going to drive some degree of impact, right? And it's no different than dealing with Alberta Environment Parks or anyone else for some of the regulatory review and approvals for some of those activities. You know, you also need to deal with the Indigenous communities that have rights and activities that are going on in that area in the same way, shape, and form. What are the impacts? How can we avoid them or mitigate them, right? Next one is choice, and I touched on this earlier. Just, again, if you're coming there, and most of the folks that are going to Indigenous communities have paid individuals who that's their job is to consult, or that's their job to plan, and they're paid, and that's their 9 to 5, and they get compensated for that. They're going in there, but a lot of the folks, particularly when you're going to some of the Indigenous communities, they don't have someone like that. They've got people, they'll talk to you, but it's not like they've got like a crew in the back that are waiting and trained and qualified. Some do, and some are getting there, but not all of them do. So you need to just acknowledge and incorporate that consideration into your discussion, that don't expect something just to fly back at you like you're talking to another forester, for example. It may be a little bit longer and it may be a bit more involved, and it'll likely come coupled with a bit of educational needs to kind of bring them up to speed and help them understand both ways for them to do the same to you. Regulatory requirements, that's a pretty straightforward. You shouldn't be doing anything professionally unless you have a pretty clear idea on what the inventory of legislative requirements are for what it is you're doing. Otherwise, that's just a recipe for getting into trouble. And it's no different when you're doing capacity building. You want to know what your minimum requirements are going to be that you have to meet under the law of the land, right, in order to then have a discussion about how to maybe modify or adjust that. It's tough to look at alternative or different scenarios without understanding where the goalposts are. You need to know how much room you got to play. And sometimes it's not very much, and sometimes it's quite a bit. It just depends. And then obviously it's important because of the risks that come if you don't do it, right? I mean, the risk is, like I say, you can increase the cost of your projects. You can increase the amount of time it takes to get it done. Or more importantly, it's a risk of reputation. I mean, no one likes being in the news or in the paper. I mean, a good example of that recent one would be in EPCOR, actually, in the city of Edmonton here just last year, when we had that incident with they're out there trying to do a ceremony. We've got some construction guys that were being ignorant. That was all over the news, believe me. And that caused ripples like you wouldn't believe throughout that company. And they would spend a lot of money and a lot of time to avoid ever having had that happen. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're considering, well, what's in it for me to do capacity building? This is it. This is your list. It helps you kind of get through this and work through these challenges and issues that come up. There's some general types of capacity building, like 3 main types in my experience, and there's different words and names that I've heard used from over the years, but really it comes down to these ones: procurement, investment, and sponsorship. And I'll kind of explain these in a bit more detail as I go through an individual. So Indigenous procurement, that's really just talking about the most straightforward type of capacity building. It's utilizing or leveraging resources, whether it be people, equipment, or skills or otherwise, that are already in place at an Indigenous community. So it's hiring them or contractor consulting, getting their equipment, and it's basically providing them with an income and utilizing providing them an uplift in economic benefit by utilizing their resources and folks to kind of help you move along. That not only does it give them money in their pocket and help, again, further improve what they're doing, but it also gives them a direct involvement in the project or whatever it is you're looking to do as well, and a better understanding because they've got skin in the game, so to speak. So it's a good way, and probably, to be honest, common ways I see capacity building occurring. Then the administrative side of that as well. So vendor setup and compliance. I talked a bit about this, and you heard Chris talk about it as well. What some companies are doing is they're actually recognizing, like, look, Indigenous communities are a little bit different. They're unique, right? They're not like going and hiring an electrician or a plumber. Not all of them have WCB account set up. Not all of them have commercial entities or businesses in place to actually do billing and invoicing. Not all of them understand, how the bookkeeping and whatnot goes, right? They certainly want to help. The passion and intent is there to get involved, but they just may not be as sophisticated or up there as well. So you can either help them get there because it's in your interest, try to work with them to kind of get what you need done, right? Or you can let them try to sort it out of themselves, and then you'll deal with some of those risks and issues we talked about above. So, but the reality is, this is the reality. We have to work through this. And if you want to work with Indigenous communities, these are some of the challenges that you're going to have to work through with it. Investments probably is the next one. So again, administrative support, that's an investment as well, right? So I mentioned it twice, right? Because you're getting these guys set up. And if you help, and I don't care if it's Indigenous community or your neighbor, if you help someone to the degree that they can get set up and you're helping clear a lot of worry and concern off of their plate, you're making them more confident and capable in what they're looking to do, that is going to be appreciated. And that's going to pay dividends for you down the road, right? So helping them set up and get to the point where they can actually work the way you want them to work as a vendor or a service provider is a good thing, right? And again, I mentioned the Indigenous specific. Some companies are actually setting up a separate procurement process that's just for Indigenous entities and communities that build a lot of these challenges into it to try to resolve it, which in a sense is almost a processed capacity building as far as the way that they deal with it. Training, that's another fairly obvious one. Short-term versus long-term. I mean, there's some short-term training that can go on, and I'll show you some examples of that. But there can be some longer-term training initiatives you set up. So an example would be like some of the utilities like NMAX and EPCOR. They have Indigenous programs set up where they subsidize or at least help or supplement some of the programs to train them to be linemen, so they can work on power lines because you need to be certain qualifications and trained to do certain things. Another example, ACK Electric does that with some of the utility management programs where they actually worked with Olds College and some of the other regulatory bodies to come up with a whole new designation for utility tree workers that accommodates some of the Indigenous needs to be able to participate in some of this work. And employment versus the administrative management. Again, just getting back to not only just training them how to do certain things, but training them how to be a business, training them how to really to walk and work within the business world that most of the bigger companies are used to dealing with. Right? And then equity opportunities. We've heard this mentioned a few times too. That can mean a whole lot of things, and I've seen it done in a whole lot of different ways. Chris had a big, long good list there in his presentation worth looking at. But again, they're typically mutually beneficial. So it gives skin in the game because there's people care a lot more when they actually own something or are going to have a net benefit from it, or that impact as well if it's going to go. So, and then ownership versus operation as well. There's a difference between just owning a piece of something and then kind of waiting for the checks to come in as an owner versus operating it, like actually saying, yeah, we own it, but we actually want to run it, or we want to have some people involved in the planning or the cutting of cut blocks or road building or whatever the case may be. So just bear in mind, those are the different facets associated with that. And then sponsorship would be the third one. And this is more, community events, sponsorship versus participation. It's, again, I mentioned that, is that it's good to, to donate money or to help build an arena or to provide, sponsor a lunch or a community event or whatever the case may be. But as much as that's probably appreciated by the Indigenous communities, and it certainly is in my experience, they would much rather have you just there. Like, they would much rather have you participate and be part of what it is they're doing and be present and to be there to answer questions and to get to know people. So I find a balance is usually best if you're going in this area. Yeah, it's good. Sure, you can sponsor things, but make sure you don't use that to replace actual involvement in what's going on. And it doesn't always have to be financial. Like I said, in kind versus financial. You can provide people, you can provide yourself, you can provide equipment, you can do all different kinds of things, in lieu of providing money as well. So just important things to bear in mind. And then knowing what the community needs are as well. Like, again, this comes back to that initial, get to know the community, sit down and talk to them. What keeps them up at night? What are they really struggling with? What would help them, right? I mean, infrastructure is one potential area. There's one company we were working with. They had a project they were proposing in a fairly remote area. They were working really good with the local Indigenous communities. They were doing training. They were involved in some of the biophysical surveys and whatnot. But what was really the problem for the community is that because they were remote, there was really crappy, if not no, cell coverage, right? And in today's world, like, it sounds silly, but everyone expects that just to happen wherever they are. And it just wasn't there. And it was actually, through the discussion, determined to be kind of a mutual issue because, yeah, the community wants cell coverage for a lot of obvious reasons, but the proponent itself, for health and safety reasons, for being able to report accidents and whatnot, that was an issue for them. So one of the sponsorship issues is that they actually paid, in part, mostly, for a cell tower to be constructed in a particular place that benefited not only the community but the project as well. So what I'm getting at is that there are ways in which you can sponsor, provide funding for things like infrastructure like that are mutually beneficial. It's just a matter of having discussions and being creative in your problem solving. Support programs are another obvious one, and those can come in a variety of forms, whether it be social, training, or otherwise. And then educational initiatives, that's always a good one too. So going in, attending, existing events, educating and teaching people about what it is you're looking to do, who you are as a company or as a government agency or otherwise. That's, again, it's all getting to know each other. Those are good things. And the more people understand who you are and what they are, the more likely you're going to be able to have an effective conversation with them. So, some general capacity building considerations. These would be my advice. So again, early engagement, start early, start as early as you can. Right. Everyone says that, but it really is the truth. The more you wait and the more you let to occur, the harder it is going to be for you to start the conversation, because you're going to have to back the bus up a bit to kind of bring them up. Right. It's way better to start early on in the game. Right. And then you establish those relationships. There's not a lot of pressure on it. You can kind of start kind of early and away you go. Transparency. Yeah, everything comes out eventually. So you might as well be open and honest about what it is you're planning to do and why. And that goes both ways, from the Indigenous community as well, and anyone involved in that. Anybody involved in these kind of capacity building initiatives needs to be open and honest for it to work. On a consistent approach. So you want to treat all impacted stakeholders fairly and consistently. So again, this is where it gets tricky for industry in particular, because they'll go for one stakeholder. And it's not just to pick on Indigenous communities, but different stakeholders may want different things, and you may end up with different things. And then you've got them pointing at each other saying, well, how come that guy got that and I got that? So it's a tough line to walk sometimes, but you do need to be consistent, right? And I just be open and honest about that. Say, well, we can't give you 10 because we gave your neighbor 5, right? And that's kind of where we're at. And that was fair in our mind, right? Legal requirements. Again, I said this once already. You got to know what the law is around what it is you're doing. And I know that sounds simplistic and silly, but you'd be surprised how many times I've run into this where this isn't the case, where I've got either clients that are working for me or even dealing with some government representatives. They weren't really aware of what the actual law, the act and regulation stated around specific issues. Make sure you know that before you go into any kind of discussion, especially if you're negotiating or something in particular. And trust. Just simply don't make promises you can't keep. Don't be flippant. I know that it's there, and especially if you're getting close to somewhere, you want to just kind of offer something, even if it's just to say, yeah, well, we're going to try, and then we'll try to get there with no real, clear confirmation internally that you can even do that. It's just, I've seen that blow up more times than I can count. definitely you want to make promises and you want to make commitments, but don't make them unless you're actually able to follow through and willing to follow through on them. It's very difficult to repair that once that occurs. And decision makers, just ensure right from the outset that the appropriate people are involved and committed on all sides. So yeah, you've got the list of contacts that the ACO has up on the web that you can start with. You've got other contacts you can probably network. I always find the best approach is to try a few people, right? Not just the ones that are listed, but others, just to make sure that nothing's changed. Economic development person is probably a good start, whatever the case would be. Because the last thing you want to do is to get halfway down a road in negotiating or consulting on a specific project, then find out actually there's two other people you should have been talking to, or they now got involved and they want wholesale changes across the board. And I've seen that happen as well. So again, back to the risks, right? You want to make sure you're doing this properly and with an open mind and deliberate plan. So I'll whip through some capacity building examples here as well. So these are some of the ones that I've gone through in recent years, just to give you guys a bit of an idea and to put some context to what I've been talking about here, blathering on about. Sunchild First Nation Community Fire Smart Plan. This is one that our company did here a few years ago for them. Again, with FREA funding. So again, it was led by them, but we helped them apply for the funding and whatnot and put the plan together. So again, it was development of a Fire Smart Community Plan. The nice thing about this one is we actually incorporated traditional values at risk into the actual model, which was interesting. Mitigation plan to proactively reduce the overall wildfire threat to community. Those of you guys who know the history there, they almost burnt up a couple times in the past. Some pretty big fires. And then an education component for community members, obviously to bring them up to speed on what Fire Smart is. So again, it's an investment type of capacity building because you're training and you're actually bringing them up to speed. It was Indigenous led, task-based training program for Indigenous participants. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about that. Whoops. So task-based, when I say this, and this is the reason I want to spend some time on this, because one of the common arguments I always hear from a lot of my clients in industries, well, they just don't have the qualifications. They're not trained. They're not a biologist. They're not a lineman. They're not this. They don't have whatever letters after their name, right? And I understand that there's laws and regulations. And there's reasons why there's those qualifications that are needed to do certain tasks. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is just there's no way that an Indigenous community member can ever do anything, without that specific letters after the name. What we try to do, and have successfully done this, I might add, in quite a few communities, including some of the ones we'll talk about here as well, is this task-based training. We refer to it as a boot camp, where you'll essentially, whatever the project is, so if you're looking to do a harvest plan, for example, you're going to have to do timber cruising. You're going to have to do some soil sampling. You might have to do creek inspections or whatever the case may be. There's no reason why you can't train people to do an individual task. I can train someone who has no environmental training. They're not a forester. They're not a soil expert in that. I can train them how to do soil surveys or weed surveys, right? And I can run them through 2 to 3 day training sessions so they can do that one task really, 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 really well. Right. And they'll do it under the guidance of someone who's actually qualified as a handler and who ideally does the training for them as well. And they move right from training into the work. And then you've now got a fully trained Indigenous member doing specialized work under the gaze and supervision of someone who's actually trained them and who's qualified to do so and will sign off on their work. They're now gaining the training for that, which they can then leverage later. For example, we've done that on projects. Then I called that band up later and saying, we trained Jimmy on doing this. I've got another project in the area. Does he want to work? Right. And then you can pull those and the band can leverage those individuals and keep a roster of those training to then be utilized in other projects. So task-based training is a really good way to go about it. Right. And I want to make sure that it only works if you're actually committed to it. So you're actually involving them. You're actually doing them formal training. You're actually holding them accountable. They got to be tested and you put them to work and they produce actual deliverables that cut the mustard for what you need. When I say task-based training, I'm not referring to what I'll call somewhat of the more traditional things we've seen where you've got companies that'll come in, they'll hire someone like a big Stantec or AMEC or whatever to kind of do their environmental evaluation. And then they'll put together, Stantec or whoever it is, will put together this big, massive project and an estimate. And they'll, for all their own folks, and then the task-based training in their mind is then they'll just pick up a couple community members and let them job shadow or whatever other label they want to put it on. They ride around in the truck, go to the field, they get paid, but really at the end of the day, they don't really get a lot of training, or at least there's a real mixed bag as far as how successful that is. So you need to be deliberate about that. Like, again, it comes back to being meaningful. Like, we want to train you. We want you to do this. We're honest. We're going to show up. So you guys got to show up. And then you work through that. It's not saying that it's not without its hiccups and challenges. It certainly isn't. And it's not easy at times, but I can tell you from experience, it's worth the trip. when you get through that, the relationship you end up with the individual communities that you're dealing with, plus the fact that you've still got the work done, and you can actually point to it, some of it at least being done by the Indigenous communities themselves, is a really, really good story. And it certainly helps in just about every other aspect that comes after you get that thing approved and permitted to construct or do, right? And these are just some of the examples. So on the fire smart stuff, we train them how to do the plots beforehand, where you're doing the hazard assessments. We walk through and how to do the delineations. We showed them how to use the tablets in the field and the GPS and how to take pictures, how to do the flagging and marking. Again, just took some time, and they went through and were actively involved in all the end products that went into the community wildfire plan. So it wasn't something that was just done, dropped off, and then sat on the shelf. The community itself was actually involved in this. And we had several community meetings that went into this to train people, to engage elders and other industry partners and what have you as well. Another example was up in Fort Chip, where there's an Indigenous company called 3 Nations Energy that partnered with ACO to basically build a solar farm up there. Again, there's some stats here on it. Basically, it was to take them off, or at least reduce the amount of reliance on isolated generation, so the diesel generator, so that they can be part of the, green power wave that we're now all living in. So there's a shot there of some of the solar arrays. So again, procurement, because we're certainly hiring some of the Indigenous entities, whether it be people to do work or equipment to do the leveling and whatnot. These are all things that are already in existence. They're just being brought in to kind of show them being brought into work, but they're being brought in to build the site for the actual solar panels and arrays to be built. And investment, because they actually trained them. We ran a boot camp similar to one I just described up there that showed them how to be environmental monitors. It showed them how to do some of the other survey and planning stuff that needed to be done for the layout and the actual construction. And they'll actually be involved in the eventual operation of this as well, as they're going to own it, the 3 Nations Energy. So great, really good. A lot of capacity building went on there. Task-based training again as well. We had everyone that was involved on the project, actively involved in that training and all the other aspects of it, and then leveraging it as well. So it was a good experience. And you can see there's some pictures of them working in the field, doing their learning and the classwork, but then also out in the field and being more hands-on, or as hands-on as we could make it. And then we had the Brazo hydro pump storage project. This was a TransAlta project. It's still in the works. But as you can imagine, for any kind of hydro work, especially in Alberta, it's usually years in the making. So the preliminary work they did involved a lot of Indigenous engagement, given where it's at. Those of you who aren't aware where the Brazo Dam is, it's kind of between Rocky Mountain House and Drayton Valley, around that neck of the woods. Beautiful country, right? And we had all 3 types of capacity building involved here. So we had procurement. Again, they were using a lot of the bands. You can see them all the bands that were involved down here. So we use a lot of their resources to kind of do work, whether it's hiring equipment or hiring folks to kind of come out. We had investment in them. So we ran the boot camp training. We showed them how to do timber cruising. We showed them how to do bush scaling. We showed them how to do water quality testing, how to be an environmental monitor, all these things. It ran over a 2-week period, actually. And we worked with all the individual bands to engage with them, tell them what we wanted to do, how we wanted to have the community members involved. We talked through what the requirements are, what type of candidates each of the bands would put forward. And we ended up with pretty good response from most of the bands that were involved. And we ended up running a 2-week boot camp, after which we immediately then put those graduates, the ones that got through it, and not all of them did, but most of them did, to work. And then again, they went through and did a lot of the preliminary environmental assessment work and planning work that went in, and it's continuing to go into that project as it evolves with TransAlta. So really good. And here's kind of a brochure that kind of shows you that TransAlta had done up, talking about showing a lot of the things that they did out there. It was done in the winter, as you can tell. But again, I was there as directly involved. You can see me there sitting down on the stairs. But it was well enjoyed by all the participants. Like I said, it was kind of led with them. It was done in their environment where they wanted to do it. We did it in the bush. We did it in remote areas. And again, it was just successful right across the board. TransAlta couldn't be happier. So I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but these are things that can occur. They just take a lot of work, right? So that's it. See, I told you I'd do this quick, guys. 24 minutes. So the intent was just to give you guys a bit of a flavor and a different perspective. Like we heard about today, we started out with the minister kind of giving that great keynote address, just kind of setting the stage and, what he's expecting, from us, all of us collectively, to kind of be doing as we work work through the various challenges we have in relation to Indigenous rights and forest management. Then we heard from the ACO, who are the regulatory authority. They deal with a lot of the actual processes and regulatory requirements and submissions and approvals, which is always good. And then we heard from the industry. We had Chris Valera give a great speech on some of the challenges that they encounter and some of the things great things they're doing and how they kind of view and approach these things. And then we heard from Kate Gunn, an Indigenous rights lawyer, who provides a lot of good context on the current case law and what things are going on and how to interpret certain things. And we heard from Todd Bailey, who works directly with Swan River First Nations, so right directly from an Indigenous community, some of the struggles and challenges that they're running through. And then what I've tried to provide here is just a bit of the consultant, the in-between guys like myself who bounce around all those other folks to talk today and have to work within those various sandboxes to collectively get to one place, right? So as you can imagine, that can be challenging as well. But it's great work, and it's certainly not boring, which is what I like. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that today. I'll turn it over and see if there's any questions. I'll have a look at the chat. Sorry, I've been blathering on here. I'll do my best to go through. A lot of accolades. That's good. All right, I'm glad everyone loves the presentation. Let's see if there's any actual questions. I'll bear with me. No, that's it. I must have satisfied everyone's questions. Oh, was any traditional ecological knowledge incorporated into Sunshine? Yes, there it was. So we went through anything they'd already done to date, which, as you can imagine, all nations, Indigenous communities are routinely going through traditional land use studies and other types of assessments to kind of identify and collect various data, traditional and otherwise, right? So, obviously working with them directly on this and being a project that was led by their community, the vault was opened, right? So we got to work we got to go through and sift through a lot of stuff, which was great and amazing and interesting. And that's how we kind of then knocked that down to identify. And, not surprisingly, it was more stuff that was spatially located on the landscape. So whether it be prayer flags or grave sites or other kind of what I'll call traditional features that are sensitive to them and need to be protected, that they don't even want showing up on a map. But we were then able to incorporate that then into the overall forest fire smart planning side of things and the treatment areas as well to kind of deal with and mitigate those while still protecting some of the things that they were worried about. So hopefully that answers that question. Good. All right. Okay, guys, I'm not seeing anything more for questions. Oh, here we go. How was the attendance on a day-to-day basis on the jobs you were on? It was actually good. So, and I'm glad you raised that. I mean, I'll try to make it not as awkward as I need to, but I'll be blunt. I mean, like I say, that's an ongoing issue that I've seen, and I know a lot of clients I work with complain about is that they don't have consistency. They don't know who's going to show up. They don't know when they're going to show up, and what have you, right? And all I can say to that was, and I'll tell you that as well, is that I would blame that on the proponent. But then you didn't do a good enough job. That's all I'd say, because I don't run into those issues. And the way that I mitigate that is spending a lot more time in the initial upfront, like I say, dealing with who the candidates are going to be, selecting who's going to attend and why they're going to attend, what the expectations are going to be. And then, as I said earlier, not all of them make it, right? They still have to test. They still need to go through that and be committed. And if they go through a boot camp of training and they actually come out of that the other end and they're still willing to work and they've completed everything, I have yet to have any one of those individuals not show up as planned or committed for any of the projects I've been on. I'm not saying it doesn't happen or won't happen at some point, but I've had generally a lot better success with that approach than just calling them up and saying, hey, who wants to work today type thing. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I certainly appreciate the ones that I did get. So what I will do, guys, is I'm gonna call it quits here then now today. I want to thank everyone for attending today's technical session. Again, I thought it was great. We had a really good slate of speakers, including the minister himself. So it doesn't get much better in my experience as far as having different resources and perspectives presented than what we kind of had here today. As I said before, all the presentations have been recorded here today. They're all going to be made available to anybody who's attending here or is registered as an attendee here later on. We just have to get them together and what have you. I'll also mention that for the practitioners on the call here, we will be having, so we being the CIF, Canadian Institute of Forestry Rocky Mountain section, will be having our annual general meeting next Thursday on the 28th. I would highly encourage those who can to attend and get involved. I know I can certainly use help, and so can a lot of others, to kind of keep this great organization humming and being able to put on technical sessions like this for everybody as well. So again, if you got any questions, feel free to give me a shout. I'll certainly help you get to that AGM if you need to. So, But I'd like to close by saying thank you guys for sure for attending today and for participating and asking all the great questions. And hopefully this gave you a little bit of something you didn't have before you started. So I will end it there. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Have a great day. And yeah, we'll see you, I'm sure, in my travels down the road at some point. Thanks.